Hello everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about the root cause of all aging and chronic disease and giving you guys a full breakdown and solutions. So the first thing we have to do is explain a mitochondria, what it is, and how it works. So you can see this simplified diagram over here of a mitochondria. So this inner part right here is what's called the mitochondrial matrix. So the innermost part is called the mitochondrial matrix. That's held together by what's called the inner membrane. And then there's an intermembrane space, which is outside of that inner membrane. And then there's an outer membrane. So you can see a mitochondria is made of an outer membrane, an intermembrane space, an inner membrane, and then the innermost part is called the mitochondrial matrix. So you can see on this diagram over here, this represents the mitochondrial matrix. This is the inner membrane, and then this is the intermembrane space, and then right out here would be the outer membrane. So this inner membrane of the mitochondria is where all the action is. That's where aging, health, chronic disease, that is essentially where everything is determined. And so we're going to be talking about this a lot today. Over here, real quick, you can see an actual mitochondria. This is an electron micrograph of a real mitochondria. So you can see these are called the inner membrane. This inner membrane actually folds in on itself and creates what are called cristae. You can see that right here. So these foldings, they call them invaginations. So these foldings of the inner membrane are called cristae. So you can see the mitochondrial cristae all along right here. And so one thing that we need to talk about with this inner membrane are these cytochrome proteins. So these cytochrome proteins are extremely important. So there's actually 5 cytochrome proteins. This is cytochrome protein 1, cytochrome protein 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And we're going to be talking about these a lot today and what they do. So these 5 cytochrome proteins make up what is called the electron transport chain. And actually the first 4 make up what's called the electron transport chain. Number 5 helps couple it to a different process, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. So basically what happens is when you eat a molecule of glucose, eventually it gets broken down into this molecule or formed in this molecule called NADH. You may have heard of NAD. It's a big topic in anti-aging and longevity, and this is actually the exact reason why. So NAD, and specifically it gets a hydrogen added to it and becomes NADH. So NADH comes up to this first cytochrome protein called cytochrome 1, and it drops off its electrons at cytochrome 1. And then what cytochrome 1 does is it passes those electrons to CoQ10. This is why we need a CoQ10, and you may have heard of CoQ10 as being a supplement, these types of things. This is actually, again, exactly why it's important. CoQ10 passes the electrons to cytochrome 3, passes the electrons on to cytochrome C, and then cytochrome C passes the electrons onto cytochrome 4. And then cytochrome 4 actually passes the electrons onto the terminal electron acceptor, which is oxygen. This is literally why you need to breathe. And again, you're going to see that so many of the things that are talked about in medicine and longevity are really explained by mitochondrial biology, and they're essentially just needed for mitochondrial metabolism because mitochondria and their healthy functioning is so important and is really almost the entire game of healthy aging and avoiding chronic disease. And additionally to that, carbon dioxide is actually what's created as a waste product from mitochondrial metabolism. And so that's literally why we need to breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2. So I want to go through the entire energy pathway here and show you how this whole process works. So when you eat an apple, it starts getting broken down in the stomach and then in the digestive tract further, and then eventually gets absorbed in the small intestine. And then, it eventually first goes to the liver, but then eventually gets into the bloodstream. And so you get this molecule of glucose that you've eaten, and it's in the bloodstream. And so then it's going to get absorbed by a cell. And let's just say for this simple example, it gets absorbed by a GLUT4 transporter on a skeletal muscle cell. So what happens is the skeletal muscle cell is expressing this GLUT4 transporter. The GLUT4 transporter takes in this molecule of glucose that you've eaten and has finally gotten in the bloodstream and into the muscle cell. So this glucose molecule gets into the cytoplasm. So this glucose molecule would be right up here at the top of this pathway. It's going to go through this entire pathway called glycolysis. So there's 9 enzymatic steps in glycolysis. So it's going to go glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, fructose 1,6-bisphosphoglycerate, goes all the way down this pathway. Eventually it gets converted into pyruvate. So pyruvate is the end product of glycolysis. Then under normal circumstances, when you've got enough oxygen present, what's going to happen is pyruvate's going to go through what's called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So this is a big enzyme complex. It's got E1, E2, E3. It's got 3 parts. After it goes through that, so it's going to be in the mitochondria now. So pyruvate dehydrogenase complex creates what's called acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA combines with this other molecule that's in the Krebs cycle called citrate. And then this whole thing just goes around and around. And basically what the main purpose of this Krebs cycle is it's just constantly spinning. And as it's spinning, it's creating these NADHs as a byproduct of the Krebs cycle spinning around. So basically what you're doing when you're eating glucose is you're eating that apple, you're feeding this glycolysis pathway, which is feeding this pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which is creating acetyl-CoAs, which is keeping this Krebs cycle turning around. That's generating NADHs, and then these NADHs go and drop off their electrons at cytochrome 1, and then it passes it along this electron transport chain. And now, what I didn't explain yet, but I want to explain now. So this NADH, in addition to dropping off 2 electrons, it also drops off protons. So for 2 NADHs, you get 4 protons that get pumped from the mitochondrial matrix from inside the inner membrane into this intermembrane space. So you get, for each 2 NADHs, you get 4 protons pumped through at complex 1, you get 4 protons pumped through at complex 3, and you get 2 protons pumped through at complex 4. And so what that does is it builds up this massive proton gradient. So you have very few protons in the mitochondrial matrix inside, and you have a ton of protons in the intermembrane space. And what that does is it creates a huge gradient from which you can derive work and energy from. And that's exactly what the 5th cytochrome protein, it's called the ATP synthase enzyme, or cytochrome 5, does. So cytochrome 5, or this ATP synthase enzyme, is literally the world's smallest turbine. It is literally a nanoturbine embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And what it does is it takes this huge proton gradient that we've created from eating food, having these NADHs pass their electrons along this electron transport chain, which is right here, which we talked about. And then as it drops off the electrons, these protons basically try to follow the electrons, and they get pumped through into this intermembrane space, creating this massive gradient. And then what this ATP synthase enzyme does, or cytochrome 5 does, it lets the protons come back through because they want to come back through. They want to come back down their gradient. But what it does is it utilizes the energy of them going through this turbine to essentially spin the turbine and synthesize ATP. It literally uses the spinning of the turbine as the protons pass through to take an ADP molecule and a phosphate and basically smash them together to create an ATP molecule, which is, of course, the energy. So it's using this proton gradient, letting them pass through, but then using the protons to drive the turbine to make ATP. And that's actually how you synthesize ATP and make energy in the human body. And this is conserved across basically all organisms. So now that we've talked about how the mitochondria works, and you understand basically how we make energy and how the mitochondria functions, we can now talk about how all aging and chronic disease begins. So all aging and chronic disease begins with suppression of this electron transport chain and mitochondrial function. And so basically we call this process that I just explained, where there's the electron transport chain happening, where the NADHs are dropping off their electrons along this electron transport chain, and then the protons are getting pumped through, and then the ATP synthase enzyme is using that to create ATP. We call that whole process, you can either call it electron transport chain coupled to oxidative phosphorylation, or you can just call it mitochondrial respiration for short. And so this entire process that we just explained of mitochondrial respiration, suppression and dysfunction of that is the root cause of all aging and chronic disease. And what is so fascinating is that Dr. Otto Warburg, his name is actually pronounced Warburg, even though it looks like Warburg. Dr. Otto Warburg literally found this almost 100 years ago. And I think we really didn't appreciate the significance and the truth and veracity of his finding until we've been able to really further prove it in hundreds of thousands of studies, really, in modern times with more advanced methods. And what's really interesting too is that two of the main people that are leading the way in doing this research are named Dr. Doug Wallace and Dr. Nick Lane, are two of the pioneers that have done a lot of work to really further this research and to really confirm and take even further what Dr. Otto Warburg found so long ago. And Dr. Thomas Seyfried is doing a lot of work in cancer specifically around this topic, and really finding essentially the same thing and taking it even further with more specificities with regards to the disease cancer. And so he deserves credit for his work as well. So we've established that all aging and chronic disease begins with suppression or dysfunction of mitochondrial respiration. And so what happens is, as you get dysfunction and damage to this electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation machinery in this inner mitochondrial membrane, what happens is you get less oxidation of NADH. So for example, we talked about how this inner membrane, and specifically cytochrome 1, takes NADH and then it takes its electrons and passes it down this electron transport chain, and then it pumps the protons through, creating a proton gradient, and which the ATP synthase enzyme uses to drive its turbine and actually make ATP. But what happens is, as this electron transport chain and these cytochrome proteins get damaged, basically the whole factory starts slowing down. So this whole production process, the whole line ends up getting slowed down. And what that causes is you get less oxidation of NADH, less burning of this fuel NADH. What that causes is, so when this Krebs cycle is just trying to spin in the normal way, making fuel, making this NADH, which gets burned. However, what happens is, as you start to get more damage and dysfunction to this electron transport chain, there's less NADH getting burned, and then that backs up the Krebs cycle. And what actually happens is, and this is one of the other key points, the Krebs cycle actually starts to spin in reverse. And 99.99999% of med students and doctors do not know that the Krebs cycle can spin in reverse. And the person that is really trying to get this information out there is Dr. Nick Lane at the University College of London. He's one of the world experts in biochemistry and mitochondria. If you want to look into this further, you can look up his work. But the Krebs cycle can actually spin in reverse. And in fact, that's actually how early bacteria and organisms actually survived and make biosynthesis of building block molecules. So we know that the Krebs cycle can and does spin in reverse when this happens. And we're going to talk about the consequences of when it does that here soon. So when you get damage to that electron transport chain and mitochondrial dysfunction of the respiration, you get less NADH oxidized, and then this Krebs cycle starts to spin in reverse like we just talked about, because the NADH isn't being burned up, the fuel isn't being burned up, and the whole cycle gets backed up and starts spinning in reverse. What happens then is, so these Krebs cycle intermediates, they basically aren't getting burned up either, and so they start to build up and they leak out from the mitochondria into the cytosol, and specifically citrate and succinate leak from the mitochondria into the cytosol, and that has a couple of really bad effects. So first off, those can directly lead to the increase of reactive oxygen species and inflammation in the cell, which can damage the cell. However, what's actually even more damaging is that they go on to stimulate these different molecules, especially this one called HIF1 alpha, which is a hypoxia and inflammation factor basically. And what it does, and other molecules like it that get stimulated by citrate and succinate, they go to the gene and they cause the transcription of literally thousands of genes. They cause the epigenetic modification and transcription of literally thousands of genes. And what this whole process does is it creates a state of chronic inflammation and hypercell division, which literally is the hallmark of aging and specifically cancer as well and other chronic diseases. So you can see that what happens is when this Krebs cycle goes into reverse flux, which again is all caused by originally by damage to that electron transport chain, aka respiratory suppression in the mitochondria. This Krebs cycle goes into reverse flux, which causes the citrate and succinate to build up. They leak out and cause damage and reactive oxygen species and inflammation directly. But what also happens even worse is that what's called stabilized, this factor called HIF1 alpha, it goes to the nucleus and causes transcription of thousands of genes, which causes a state of chronic inflammation and hypercell division in the cell. So additionally to that, so when you have that original, respiratory suppression where the electron transport chain and those cytochrome proteins get damaged, and you get the less burning and oxidation of NADH, which backs up in the Krebs cycle and causes the Krebs cycle to go into reverse flux. It also causes the entire rest of the energy pathway to basically get backed up. So the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which remember is what we said feeds into the Krebs cycle, that gets backed up, and then that backs up the entire glycolysis pathway, which has major implications. So what happens is normally glucose goes through glycolysis and gets turned into pyruvate, and then pyruvate goes through that pyruvate dehydrogenase complex that we talked about, and which then makes acetyl-CoA and goes through the Krebs cycle to create NADH and create energy. But what happens is when you get backing up of this entire energy pathway, glucose can't get turned into pyruvate, then go through that pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So what happens is pyruvate actually gets shunted into this lactate pathway, and actually pyruvate starts making lactate instead of eventually making NADH. And what happens is this feeds what is called the Warburg effect, which you may have heard of and is highly associated with cancer. So again, this glucose goes through glycolysis, but the pyruvate can't go through the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex because the entire pathway is backed up. So instead what happens is pyruvate gets increasingly shunted into making lactate, and then lactate basically feeds this cancer cell formation. And we know from Dr. Thomas Seyfried's work and many other people that essentially all cancer cells are fermenting glucose into lactate far more than normal cells. So this is highly associated with cancer as well as aging and other chronic diseases. So you can see what happens is this entire energy pathway gets backed up. Again, you get this original electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation damage, this mitochondrial respiration damage to these cytochrome proteins. That causes less oxidation of NADH. That causes the Krebs cycle to go into reverse flux, which allows the release of citrate and succinate and other Krebs cycle intermediates, which go out and cause inflammation and hypercell growth essentially. And then additionally, the entire rest of the energy pathway gets backed up with this pyruvate dehydrogenase complex getting backed up. That backs up the glycolysis cycle. Pyruvate, instead of going through the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, gets shunted into lactate, which is associated with cancer cell metabolism and increased risk of cancer cell formation. Additionally, when you're creating lactate, basically it can't go through the normal pathway to make this NADH and go through complex 1 to make energy. So it actually has to go through this other pathway called the glycerol phosphate shunt, and it enters the electron transport chain at cytochrome 3 instead of cytochrome 1, and that gives you only 6 protons getting pumped into the intermembrane space instead of 10. So that means less protons can go through this ATP synthase enzyme, which is cytochrome 5. You can remember that nanoturbine we talked about, which actually makes the ATP. So that means you're making less protons can go through that. So that means you're making less ATP. So that means you have less energy. So you can begin to see how this entire pathway, which all began with this original damage to this electron transport chain and the cytochrome protein machinery, in the inner mitochondrial membrane. That leads to less energy, which of course leads to aging, and you can't repair your cells as well, and your cells can't function as well. And that also leads to just a prototypical cancer cell formation and phenotype, where normal cancer cells have less energy because they can't run the electron transport chain as effectively. They've got this Warburg metabolism going, and we're going to add a couple more pieces here that really are going to begin to show you how cancer cells actually form in the body, and the metabolism and original root cause that are associated with it. So again, in addition to everything we just talked about, when you get backing up of this entire energy pathway, so again, remember, this is the glycolysis pathway. So usually glucose goes from glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphoglycerate, all the way down to that pyruvate molecule, which goes into the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, etc. So instead of that happening, when this entire pathway gets backed up, this glucose 6-phosphate molecule, which is the first molecule in the step after glucose, it can't go through the rest of the pathway because the entire rest of the pathway is backed up. So what it has to do instead is it gets shunted into this NADPH pathway. And what that does is it creates a ton more biosynthesis of these basic cell building block molecules. And the problem with that is that's exactly what cancer cells do. So you already have this cell is in a state of hypergrowth based on the stabilization of that HIF-1 alpha factor with the Krebs cycle going into reverse flux that I talked about earlier. So now the cell's already wants to be in a state of hypergrowth, and now you're giving it the building blocks to do so by getting all this glucose 6-phosphate shunted over to this NADPH pathway, because the entire energy pathway is already backed up. This basically is what allows these cancer cells to divide so rapidly, and it's why normal cells don't do so, because this pathway isn't backed up, so more of this glucose 6-phosphate can just flow through the rest of this process and make normal energy, and so then you and your cells can have more energy and be vital. So you can begin to see how aging and even cancer cells are formed and where this whole problem and process begins. So on top of all that, this whole thing is a vicious cycle. So any damage to that respiratory chain, to that electron transport chain, and those cytochrome proteins, that tends to increase the reactive oxygen species, because again, the electrons can't flow normally and the whole chain is getting backed up. So you get this basically backing up of the whole energy factory, so to speak. That increases reactive oxygen species, and again, most of that derives from the iron sulfur clusters in complex 1 being that first cytochrome protein. And so ultimately, you've got this increased reactive oxygen species due to damage to the electron transport chain, and the only way to get those reactive oxygen species and the inflammation back under control is to further suppress complex 1 and further suppress that entire electron transport chain. But the problem with that is that's the whole original problem in the first place, because we know from Dr. Doug Wallace's work and Dr. Nick Lane's work and Dr. Thomas Seyfried's work and even Dr. Otto Warburg's original work almost 100 years ago, the whole original problem and cause of aging and chronic disease and cancer is basically dysfunction and a lack of energy production and a lack of efficiency of that electron transport chain and that mitochondrial respiration along the inner membrane that we've talked about. So that's the whole original problem. However, it's the only way to get reactive oxygen species under control. So again, you can see how the whole thing is a vicious cycle. And so what we really want to do is to try to prevent damage in the first place, and to support our mitochondria and to support that electron transport chain and those cytochrome proteins, which is exactly what we're going to talk about here. So lastly, before we get into the solutions and what we want to do to help keep our mitochondria healthy, I just want to give a quick summary of everything that we just went over. So again, the root cause, the fundamental metabolism changes that occur with aging, all chronic diseases, and cancer, it fundamentally begins with damage and dysfunction of the cytochrome proteins and this electron transport chain coupled to the oxidative phosphorylation process, with this whole thing right here that we've been talking about. That leads to less oxidation of NADH, leads to the Krebs cycle not flowing normally like it should, but actually getting backed up and starting to go into reverse flux to literally flow backwards. That leads to a buildup of all the Krebs cycle intermediates because they're not getting burned up like they normally are. So these things, especially citrate and succinate, they actually leak out from this inner mitochondrial matrix into the cytosol. And once in the cytosol, they do things like stabilize HIF1 alpha, which then goes to the nucleus and causes the transcription of thousands of genes, which creates this state of chronic inflammation and hypercell growth. Additionally to that, the entire energy pathway gets backed up, so that pyruvate dehydrogenase pathway gets backed up, and then the glycolysis pathway gets backed up. So when that whole thing gets backed up, you get increased shunting of pyruvate instead of eventually getting turned into this NADH, getting burned for lots of ATP. The pyruvate gets shunted into lactate, which makes less energy as it goes through this complex 3. So now the cell's already starting to get into a state of less energy, which is already the root of all aging and chronic disease. But additionally, that more lactate is actually creating that Warburg metabolism, which is highly associated with cancer especially, but also even just aging and poor cell health. And then additionally to that glucose 6-phosphate molecule that we talked about can't go through the rest of the glycolysis pathway. So it's also getting shunted into that NADPH pathway to create the more biosynthesis of these building block molecules, which again really just creates the perfect metabolism and the perfect environment for cancer to be able to flourish and be able to hyper divide, because it's got all the building blocks it needs because this entire energy pathway is backed up. And additionally to that, more glucose molecules aren't getting burned through this high energy pathway, through this getting turned into that NADH to create lots of ATP. So you're getting even less energy too. So you can see how this whole process leads to a state of chronic energy deficiency, chronic inflammation, hypercell growth and division, and that Warburg metabolism in the cell, which is really the hallmark of all aging, cancer, and chronic disease. So now that I've taken you through the entire process and you understand basically how things go wrong in the human body, the root cause of aging, and really a lot of basically the entire downstream pathway of how aging and chronic diseases occur with that original root cause of being the damage to this electron transport chain and the mitochondrial dysfunction. Now I want to talk about the top things you can do to slow that process down and to avoid chronic diseases and to stay healthy and to promote anti-aging as much as you possibly can in yourself. So the first thing I want to talk about is sunlight. A personalized, wisely dosed sunlight exposure routine is one of the best things you can do for your health and anti-aging. And I want to talk about why. So these cytochrome proteins that we have spent so much time talking about, they are all light chromophores. So they all specifically absorb specific frequencies of sunlight. And what happens is when you get the red and infrared light from the sun, it actually helps increase the efficiency of these cytochrome proteins. So it actually helps them work better. So getting sunlight, and again, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to burn and get too much of that high energy UV light exposure. But when you get this red and infrared, especially light from the sun, and again, you can actually get, if you want to get just red and infrared A light, you can actually get that in the morning, especially before the UV pops up. Although UV light also has a lot of other benefits, which we'll talk about in later videos. But again, you want it to be properly dosed. You don't want to overdo it. So this red and infrared light, when you get it, it actually helps increase the efficiency and the function of these cytochrome proteins. So you're actually helping your health at the true root cause and at the root level of your biology. And what's really interesting too is that artificial blue light actually inhibits this electron transport chain. It actually inhibits this process, so you literally make less energy when this is happening. And again, it's because these cytochrome proteins actually absorb certain wavelengths of light and they have different effects. So really one of the best things you could do is try to get outside more and get more sunlight. Again, don't overdo especially daytime sunlight with high UV levels, but to get more sunlight and to try to get outside more and avoid the chronic artificial blue light exposure, because that will help increase the health and function of these cytochrome proteins. So that's number one. Number two is a good circadian rhythm and proper circadian rhythm and sleep hygiene. This is huge. So essentially, and I talked about this in one of my first videos, but there is a time for your mitochondria to be making energy so that you can have lots of energy for your daily activities. And then there's also time for your mitochondria to kind of shut the factory down and repair and regenerate. And that is supposed to be happening every single night when you go to sleep. However, if you are on your phone till midnight or 1 a.m. and you're getting that blue light signal, your body will not go into the repair and regeneration process. And specifically, what really is repairing and regenerating is the mitochondria. So your mitochondria literally undergo these mitophagy and cellular cleanup, these mitochondrial cleanup processes when you are asleep at night. However, they don't undergo these processes essentially if you are getting a blue light signal through your eyes and skin even late into the night, because that is the signal that when the blue light is gone, basically that's how your brain knows that the sun has gone down and that it's nighttime and that now I'm supposed to be repairing. So what a lot of people are doing, they're getting this chronic blue light exposure, even late into the night. So then they're not repairing their mitochondria properly. So these cytochrome proteins don't get repaired. And then you get the early aging and the whole process that we talked about with the energy pathway backup and all of that. So it's really important to not view blue light at night, and then also try to get morning sunlight exposure as the sun is rising. So try to catch the sunrise so that you can regulate the circadian rhythm and have healthy mitochondria and get the full mitochondrial repair process each night. So that's really important. The third thing that's really important is aerobic exercise. So exercise in general is great, but specifically a well-planned aerobic exercise program is huge for mitochondrial health. So aerobic exercise specifically is a powerful stimulus. It is literally a hormetic stimulus that when dosed properly, you can increase the capacity and function of your mitochondria. Again, it's a little bit of, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So as you kind of gradually increase your training and you're able to have a greater and greater aerobic capacity, what's literally happening is you're training your mitochondria, you're forcing them to adapt and become stronger, become more efficient, become healthier, become better. And so aerobic exercise has a huge impact on this whole electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation and the mitochondrial respiration process that we spent so much time talking about. Has a huge effect on making that whole process more effective and making your mitochondria healthy. So that's a really big one. Another really big one is regular low intensity movement, such as walking, combined with not overeating. So what happens is, if you are sedentary and you're not doing a lot of moving, not getting a lot of exercise, and you're overeating on top of that, what can happen is you can essentially mimic this entire process that I just talked about, where the energy pathways get backed up and you get extra and excessive reactive oxygen species and inflammation, and the Krebs cycle goes into reverse flux and the whole energy pathway gets backed up. You can essentially mimic that just by not getting any exercise and overeating. You just back up this entire energy pathway just through that. And so the whole point that you want to do is you don't want this energy pathway to get backed up. You want it to be healthy and that whole pathway that I talked about to be flowing nicely. And so that's why regular low intensity movement, like regular walking breaks and regular exercise breaks, combined with not overeating, is really important to preserve the health of your mitochondria for all the reasons I just talked about. The fifth one that I want to talk about here is limiting deuterium intake. So I'll have to do a whole video just on deuterium because it's really not well understood, or a very little known molecule and topic for whatever reason, because it's extremely important. And I think the reason is because it's a little bit of a newer topic, but it is a really important topic, and the literature on this is really taking off. There's a ton of papers being published in the last few years and right now. But essentially, so the thing is that hydrogen, the atom hydrogen, basically comes in two flavors. It's called an isotope. So regular hydrogen, and then the molecule deuterium. And so deuterium is like heavy hydrogen. So it basically has an extra neutron in the nucleus. It is twice the atomic size and mass. And so what happens is, if this NADH molecule doesn't get regular hydrogen, it gets deuterium. So then that deuterium gets pumped into the inner membrane space. And then what happens is this ATP synthase enzyme, which again, remember, it's that world's smallest turbine. When that deuterium tries to go through that ATP synthase enzyme, it can't because it's literally too big, and it breaks this turbine, it breaks this fifth cytochrome. And again, we know that this damage to this the cytochrome proteins is basically the root cause of all aging and disease. And so when you get a bunch of damage because of this deuterium molecule, that causes increased early aging and death and early chronic disease because of damage to this process and the whole thing that happens afterwards with the energy pathways getting backed up and the inflammation, etc. And so what you want to do is you just want to try to limit your deuterium intake through diet as much as possible. And so the most simple, best way to do that I want to give you right now is, first thing you want to do is don't eat anything that is man-made. Don't eat anything that didn't come from nature. So what's interesting is that nature actually already has a built-in deuterium process, a deuterium control process, if you will, where it already is limiting the amount of deuterium in all of the foods that you eat, because deuterium actually hurts plants and animals too. So all the plants and animals are actually already trying to limit the deuterium in their systems. However, of course, Nestle and anything that's created by man, they're not eliminating the deuterium. Nature basically is, like these plants and animals are. So that's the first thing you can do. And then additionally, if you want to further limit your deuterium, eating a lot of green leafy vegetables, those are low in deuterium. And then eating grass-fed animal products, those are also lower in deuterium, especially the animal fats are low in deuterium. So those are some further steps that you can take as well if you want to further this process. Lastly, so stress management, and I'm not going to go into huge long detail on this. I think we all know that stress is really important, and that excess stress can be very damaging. And really what happens is stress literally causes morphological changes to the mitochondria and damages mitochondrial function. So you really would just want to limit excess stress and try to manage the stress in your life as much as possible, as best you can. Now I want to get to a few of the honorable mentions that weren't quite in the top 6, but are also really important. So I actually think that your breath and that breathing optimally, so deep, slowly, and through the nose, and then also learning proper ribcage mechanics during breathing is actually really important, and I might have to do a video on that at some point. But learning how to breathe optimally, I really think can actually possibly help add some years to your life. And especially when you contrast that to, say, if you were to breathe slowly through the nose with proper ribcage mechanics your entire life, as opposed to breathing really fast, really shallow mouth breathing over your entire life. I really think that can add some years to your life. And what's interesting is we know that there's actually a general rule in biology that you only get a certain amount of heartbeats in your lifetime. And there's a few species and animals that break the rule, but it is a general rule that most organisms fit, is that you only get a certain amount of heartbeats in your lifetime. And what actually happens is through your breath, you can actually slow and control your heart rate. So I think there's definitely something to that how you breathe can really influence your health and lifespan. And it can also really influence your stress levels too, which feeds into that. So the breath part is really important. And I think as a just simple first step, trying to just be mindful of your breathing and try to breathe a little more slowly through the nose can really be beneficial for a lot of people. And then the next one, avoiding pesticides, toxins as best as possible. And again, I won't go into super detail on that in this podcast, but what's interesting is a lot of the really bad pestins and toxins are actually mitochondrial toxins that damage this respiratory complex and these cytochrome proteins that I've spent so much time talking about. A lot of the ones that are really bad, that really cause damage and these chronic diseases and early aging and things like that, they damage this process right here that I just spent so much time talking about. And so again, you want to just try to do your best as you can to limit your toxin exposure. And then lastly is resistance training. So what's interesting is that resistance training actually isn't as big of a direct mitochondrial stimulus. And again, it does have some mitochondrial benefits directly, where it will stimulate some direct mitochondrial benefits and help with the health and efficiency of this, but not nearly as much as aerobic exercise. So again, just a mild direct mitochondrial stimulus, if you will. However, resistance training is really important for what I like to think about and call just the practical reasons of aging. And so let's just do a kind of quick thought experiment here. So say you really just crush throughout your whole life, you just crush these mitochondrial health topics, and you're getting the perfect amount of sunlight exposure, you're crushing the circadian rhythm and sleep, you're getting your aerobic exercise on a perfect plan, you're not overeating, you're getting lots of walking in, you're limiting your deuterium intake, you're doing the stress management, you're breathing well, you're avoiding toxins as best you can. You might live a very long time. You might very well live to be 100, 110, etc. And however, if you're not resistance training, so your mitochondria might be healthy enough to take you to 100 plus, 110, whatever. But if you're not resistance training, then it becomes a question of, will you be strong enough to still get off the couch? Because your mitochondria might be healthy enough, you might be healthy enough to live to 110 or whatever it may be. But if you're not doing any resistance training, you might not be able to get off the couch and go get yourself in a car and go to your grandkids' house to visit them, or still be able to do your hobbies, be able to just get up, move around, these types of things. You may not be able to do that if you're not resistance training throughout the lifespan. And so resistance training has some special benefits that deserve its own category. And it also has a ton of benefits for bone density, which again is really important as we age, because we lose bone density exponentially as we get into our older years, especially if we're not resistance training. So I really just wanted to highlight that as something that deserves talking about, but being a little bit more in its own category. And then lastly, I just wanted to say that this is a purely educational presentation, and this is not medical advice. And then I just want to thank everybody so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Let me know your feedback. Let me know what you thought of the video, any questions, comments, concerns that you have. And let me know any topics that you want me to do in the future. So thank you so much.